Thanks to everyone for taking the time to join us today. And thanks for your patience, those of you who may have joined a little bit early and have been waiting for a little bit. And welcome to this Climate Policy Initiative webinar on the lab. My name is Ben Brochet, and I'm a Senior Associate in CPI's San Francisco offices and the Program Manager for the Global and Brazil Labs. I'll be moderating what should hopefully be a very engaging webinar today. I'm joined by my colleagues Bella Tonkanogi, also based in San Francisco, and Gloria Coleman, based in our London offices. For those of you who aren't familiar with Climate Policy Initiative, with deep experience in policy and finance, CPI works to improve the most important energy and land use practices around the world. Our mission is to help governments, businesses, and financial institutions drive growth while addressing climate risk. We have offices in Brazil, Europe, India, Indonesia, and the US. CPI serves as the secretariat for the lab. So the format of this webinar will be a 35-minute presentation followed by a Q&A session where all attendees will be on mute. You're welcome to submit questions by typing them into the chat box, and we will address them during the Q&A time. We're also happy to answer any questions via email after the event. So just for the agenda today, firstly, we'll offer a brief introduction to the lab programs. Secondly, we'll showcase some lab successes and impacts to date, followed by highlighting the most recent round of instruments and the call for ideas, which is currently open, and then we'll move to the Q&A. So to kick off, I'm just going to give a brief introduction and set some context. So the Paris Agreement and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, both adopted in 2015, are frameworks for addressing key challenges that are facing communities, governments, companies, and individuals around the world in the 21st century. Achieving the Paris Agreement and SDG goals and transitioning to a global, low-carbon, and resilient economy will take an incredible amount of collaboration and innovation across sectors and geographies, and rapid movement from talk to action. Scaling up investment will be a crucial element of achieving these global goals. According to CPI analysis, in 2015 and 2016, there was an annual average of $410 billion invested in mitigation and adaptation globally. So this is a fraction of the estimated 16 trillion or so needed by 2030 to achieve a 2-degree pathway. It's clear that we need to move from billions to trillions, and the majority of that funding will need to come from the private sector. There are several barriers that stand in the way of scaling up investment in climate finance and green growth. These include policy and knowledge gaps, inadequate access to or a high cost of capital, and a key factor here is investor risk, whether real or perceived. This is particularly true within the context of developing markets. So how does the lab aim to tackle this challenge? The lab seeks to address this investment gap by identifying, developing, and launching sustainable finance solutions that have transformative potential to drive billions of dollars in private sector investment into the low-carbon, climate-resilient economy. The lab includes 4 programs: the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, which was the original lab program launched in 2014, and it focuses on ideas that have the potential to scale up climate finance in all developing countries. We also have 2 regional labs focused on India and Brazil respectively that adapt the lab approach to the market priorities, needs, as well as the NDC and development goals of those specific geographies. The Global, India, and Brazil labs focus mainly on earlier stage ideas, and typically those ideas that seek to leverage public or concessional finance effectively in order to catalyze private finance in target sectors. To complement these, the FIRE Awards focuses on post-pilot, later stage businesses and concepts to drive green growth in both developed and developing countries. So who makes up the lab? We're fortunate to have an incredible network of partners across the public, development finance, philanthropic, and private sectors. The lab's partners currently include 12 governments, 19 financial services companies, 18 development banks, 17 corporate partners in other sectors, 6 foundations, and 3 universities, with CPI serving as the secretariat. So how does it work? Gloria is going to go into a little more detail on the process a bit later in the webinar, but our theory of change really revolves around 5 main actions. Firstly, an open global call for innovative investment solutions, which has brought in hundreds of ideas from a diverse group of proponents in our first 3 years. Secondly, our global network of members, which you saw on the previous slide, then works to select the most promising and potentially transformative ideas. Then the Secretariat, lab members, and working groups comprised of other experts partner with selected lab proponents to develop their idea into an actionable, bankable finance solution. For the FIRE Awards, we provide pitch coaching in this phase. Once the analytical phase is completed, lab members vote to endorse the final instruments, signaling readiness for launch and their full support. The focus then moves to fundraising to launch pilots with support from the network, moving from concept to action. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Bella to speak a bit about the successes and impacts of the lab in its first 3 years.
Great. Thank you so much, Ben. So I'll speak first to some of our aggregate results from the first 3 years of the lab, and then we'll talk a bit about some of the most recent instruments that have been endorsed in the lab, so you get a flavor for the specific types of initiatives and instruments that we work with. So the lab has grown every year. As Ben mentioned, it started as the Global Lab in 2014 with 4 instruments endorsed that year, covering renewable energy, energy efficiency, and climate change adaptation. And we've since grown, adding instruments to the Global Lab, but also adding new initiatives and instruments under the lab's umbrella, including 2 regional labs in Brazil and India, as well as the FIRE Awards. In total, to date, the lab has endorsed 25 instruments and award winners. So what are these instruments? They're certainly diverse, covering every region around the globe. You can see that Brazil and India have a high number of ideas because they have labs devoted to these countries. The FIRE Awards have concentrated mostly in developed economies, while global lab instruments focus on all developing country regions. We've had more instruments selected and endorsed in climate mitigation than in climate adaptation, reflecting, among others, both the newness and challenges of adaptation as an investment opportunity. So how have these instruments done once launched into the market? And we're very proud that they've collectively raised nearly $1 billion for climate change mitigation and adaptation. To disaggregate this a bit further, many people often ask us whether lab endorsement comes with financial support. And while this isn't promised ex ante, we can say that lab members have invested over $200 million into endorsed lab instruments. That funding has in turn helped raise another $500 million from non-lab members directly for the instruments. And finally, the instruments themselves, once under implementation, leverage additional financing from co-investments on the ground and also from replication. We've already seen one instrument replicated by another organization in new geographies. And as lab instruments progress in their implementation in the coming years, we expect the leverage numbers in particular to grow. Finally, as the objective of the lab is to mobilize private climate finance, we also are frequently asked about the success of instruments in raising capital from the private sector. While most of our endorsed instruments are still at early stages, we've already had some important successes in raising private finance from institutional investors, commercial banks, and private equity. We next wanted to give some more specific information about the instruments so you have a better sense as to the types of innovations that the lab focuses on. The following slides will provide you an overview of the instruments that the lab endorsed in 2017 following months of selection and analysis. These instruments are newly launched and are actively raising capital. I'll speak to the first ones in large-scale renewable energy and then turn to my colleagues to discuss instruments in adaptation, sustainable land use, distributed generation, and transit. So this year, the lab endorsed several instruments focused on addressing barriers to deployment of large-scale renewable energy. These instruments look at several critical barriers to renewable energy investment. In the first case, the Renewable Energy Scale-Up Facility tackles the barriers to investment in the earliest stages of a renewable energy project's development. These critical earliest stages are the period in which project costs are comparatively low, around 1 to 5% of total project costs, but where the risks to investors are the highest. The facility seeks to both reduce and manage these risks to bring in investors that wouldn't otherwise be willing to invest at this stage. The Green Receivables Fund instrument from the Brasil Lab is focused on investment barriers in Brazil, where recent changes in the National Development Bank have significantly reduced the financing available for renewable energy. The Green Receivables Fund seeks to set up a private financial mechanism that combines existing regulatory frameworks, green certification criteria, and a financial model tailored to the needs of renewable energy and energy efficiency projects to raise capital. I'll now turn to Ben to speak about the adaptation and resilience instruments.
Thanks, Bella. Sorry, it was a bit of a delay coming off mute there. So the lab brought forward a few instruments focused on adaptation, resilience, and land use in the past cycle. The first was climate smart cattle ranching, which came through Brasil Lab, and it takes a unique angle on addressing deforestation from cattle ranching in Brazil, which is the world's largest cattle producer. The instrument will increase the supply of deforestation-free beef from the Amazon by providing both financial and technical assistance to ranchers that comply with the Brazilian Forest Code, adopting more sustainable and efficient practices and restoring pasture lands. The program could reduce the emissions intensity of beef per kilo by up to 95% in pilot areas. Secondly, Cloud Forest Blue Energy Mechanism, which aims to mobilize domestic commercial finance to reforest and conserve cloud forests in Latin America that provide not only key ecosystem services, but crucial benefits to the hydropower industry. It uses an innovative pay-for-success financing technique in which a hydropower plant pays for a measurable ecosystem benefit provided by cloud forests within the plant's catchment, monetizing benefits and financing conservation and restoration activities. And lastly, CRAFT, led by the Lightsmith Group, is the first commercial investment that will focus on expanding the availability of technologies and solutions for climate adaptation and resilience. As a growth equity fund, CRAFT will invest in companies that have proven technologies and demonstrated market demand, leveraging concessional and commercial capital to enhance the resilience of businesses, communities, and critical infrastructure, while helping to catalyze a global market for resilience investments. I'll now turn it over to Gloria to speak a bit about distributed clean energy.
Great. Thanks so much, Ben. In addition to this year's trends and solutions for large-scale renewables, as well as in adaptation, resilience, and land use, the lab also had a very strong trend in solutions for distributed clean energy, with the endorsement of 3 new instruments: distributed generation for cooperatives in the Brasil Lab, and the Sustainable Energy Investment Trust and Sustainable Energy Bonds in the India Lab, which you'll see on the next slide, as well as 1 fire winner, the SunShift Solar Asset Financing Facility. While all 4 solutions incorporate an aggregation feature to help spread risk across projects, and lower the high cost of capital, key distinctions among the financial structures of each allow them to address specific sectoral and geographic needs, including cooperatives in agriculture and other industries in Brazil, and off-grid mining and on-grid utilities in Argentina, as well as small-scale solar developers in India, where a new investment vehicle will expand access to equity and debt, and a new class of bonds will introduce standardized impact measurement and reporting to increase access to debt while also building a track record for mainstream debt issuers. Finally, we had an exciting solution for sustainable transit, Proterra Electric Bus Battery Service Agreements, which came through as a Fire Awards winner and provides an excellent example of the need for innovations in finance to accompany innovations in technology. In particular, Proterra is the manufacturer of zero-emission electric buses, which have won numerous awards for its cutting-edge battery technology. However, high upfront costs have hindered the sale of its buses, which can initially cost up to 50% more than conventional diesel. To address this challenge, Proterra recently introduced a new lease financing model through the introduction of battery service agreements, making Proterra bus prices the same price or lower than conventional buses from day one, and thereby promising to help accelerate a shift to more sustainable transit. So after launching a total of 9 new instruments in the last cycle, we are really excited that the lab has opened a new call for ideas and is currently seeking proposals for the next generation of financial instruments and early stage businesses that can help unlock investment to tackle some of the most difficult sustainable development challenges in 2018. I'll now walk through some of the key information surrounding the call, including key dates, what happens if your idea is selected, and what the lab looks for in the process of assessing submissions. The call will cover all 4 programs, to which you can apply online at climatefinancelab.org, but only until 28th of November when the call will close. Notification of selection will happen in early February. But why submit? First, selected instruments receive guidance and support from high-level leaders who contribute expertise and capital to the development of instruments. And in addition, instruments selected into the global Brazil and India labs receive $150,000 worth of analytical and communication support from Climate Policy Initiative's team of experts. While initiatives selected as Fire Awards finalists get to pitch their initiative on stage to an audience of 1,000 finance and business leaders at the annual BNEF Future of Energy Summit in New York. And these 3 opportunities have together been fundamental in helping lab instruments collectively mobilize $977 million in finance for climate-friendly projects around the world. So what are we looking for? The lab has 4 overarching criteria that apply to all 4 of its programs. These are actionability, innovation, catalytic potential, and financial sustainability. You can see these definitions as we prescribe them set out here and also on the website. However, in addition to these criteria, each program has its own distinct area of focus, as Ben mentioned earlier. The Global Lab focuses on ideas to scale up, finance, and mitigation and adaptation across all developing countries, while the Brazil Lab focuses on ideas that can support its national climate priorities, and the India Lab focuses on ideas for accelerated investment in infrastructure for green growth. Finally, the Fire Awards, which focus on early-stage pilots and businesses that are already on fire and need support to achieve impact at scale. Finally, what happens if your idea is selected? Here there are 2 general tracks, one for the lab, which you can see across the top of the slide, and one for the Fire Awards, which is shown at the bottom. Both tracks feature 3 core phases of work over slightly different timelines, but both beginning in February when you will be notified of selection. If your idea is selected for one of the 3 lab programs, phase 1 begins with idea development. This phase will run for about 6 months through July and will include fairly intensive work with a team of 2 CPI analysts and a working group of experts to stress test the idea, including refinement of its mechanics, analysis of its financial, social, and environmental benefits, and mapping of implementation risks and mitigation strategies, as well as pilot preparation. In August, following the analytical work during the development phase, instrument teams will prepare to present the refined instrument and implementation plan to the lab members for endorsement during Climate Week in September, when lab members will vote to endorse ideas if they meet the lab criteria, and you will have the opportunity to present your idea to donors and investors at an innovation summit following the meeting. Finally, should your instrument be endorsed by the lab, there will be a formal 6-month period of support, during which time the Secretariat assists you in reaching near-term milestones for growth. And this is a completely new element we've introduced to the lab process this year, as we've noted a key challenge after endorsement is really getting off the ground and the need for further support from the lab to do so successfully. Next, looking at the bottom of the slide, should your idea be selected as a FIRE finalist, phase 1 begins with pitch development. In this phase, you'll work with the CPI Secretariat and a FIRE coach to develop a 3-minute pitch for the BNEF Summit in April. At the summit, you will have the opportunity to compete in an on-stage pitch competition where 1,000 investors and leaders at the summit will vote right there on the top 1 to 2 ideas to be recognized as FIRE winners. Should your idea be voted a FIRE winner, you will receive support from a CPI-led working group of experts on 1 to 2 deliverables to help you reach near-term milestones for growth. Here, I need to note that as the Secretariat is still in the process of confirming funding for a full 2017 to 2018 cycle of the FIRE Awards, there is a small chance that the FIRE Awards will not be able to move forward with the selection of finalists to present at the summit. However, we still really encourage prospective applicants to make a submission to ensure consideration of their idea should funding be confirmed, and also since any submissions identified as a potential fit for other programs will be considered for those as well. With that, I would like to thank you all for taking the time to join us for this webinar today and hand it back over to Ben, who will moderate a question and answer session. Thank you all again. We look forward to your hopeful submissions, and back to you, Ben.
Thanks so much, Gloria. And at this point, as she mentioned, we will take your questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, please go ahead and type that into the chat box. At this point, we'll just wait for a few minutes to gather those questions and organize those a bit. So please feel free to type those in now. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for the terrific questions. I'll try to address a couple right now, and then I may turn a couple over to my colleagues to address. And I'm not sure that we'll have the chance to actually speak to all of these on the call, since there's been quite a few that have come through. But once again, we're more than happy to answer questions via email after the webinar. You can send us an email at lab@cpiclimatefinance.org. But first of all, there were a few questions about the availability of this webinar and the content afterwards. That's a very easy question to respond to. We will be posting a recording of this webinar as well as a PDF of the slides that were presented up on the CPI website at some point in the next week. So that will be available publicly to anyone. There were also a few questions about the criteria and kind of what we're specifically looking for. Obviously, those are great questions. One from Indira Milano, just to elaborate on the criteria that's specific for the different programs. So I'll let my colleague Gloria speak to the FIRE awards a little bit later and how that differs, since she is the program manager for that. But just to say the criteria for the labs, the Brazil, India, and global are actually all the same. So they're those 4 core criteria that we're looking for. So is your idea innovative? Is it a clear value add to the marketplace? And is it taking a new approach or an existing approach to a new problem or geography? Is it actionable? Can it be deployed quickly under current policy and market constraints? Or does it face major regulatory barriers? Would be something that would make it not actionable. Is it financially sustainable? So do you have a clear pathway? There was another question about does the idea need to mobilize private finance immediately, or can it utilize public resources to in turn bring in private finance to a given sector? Many lab ideas do leverage concessional or public or philanthropic capital, some sort of catalytic capital at the beginning, but the goal needs to be, and there needs to be a pathway to phasing out that initial concessional or public capital and bringing in private capital, thereby achieving market viability and commercialization. And finally, our 4th criteria is catalytic. So we're looking for ideas that are replicable ideally in other sectors or geographies, or could be scaled quite quickly. So leveraging a relatively small comparative initial investment and driving billions in finance in a relatively short period of time. So scale is important. One other question came through about consulting during November to develop the application. So in order to ensure kind of equality and equity across all of the ideas, we don't partner with potential proponents to develop their ideas. If there is a very specific question, we can answer that. But really, what we can provide is kind of guidance around what the criteria are, what we're looking for. And I would say one of the best things to do is, in addition to the instruments presented today, take a look at the lab website and see the kinds of ideas that have been selected in the past. They really run a huge array of approaches. The proponents have been individual one-person startup organizations all the way to large institutions. They've been proponents have spanned multiple geographies and are really a very diverse set. So if you want to get an idea of kind of the sorts of instruments that we have brought forward and see if there might be some synergies there, would definitely encourage you to do so. I will go ahead and turn it over to Gloria at this point. There were some questions about kind of the differences between the lab and the fire awards, what fire is looking for, and also kind of the future or the funding future of fire in the next cycle.
Thanks so much, Ben. Yes, so in terms of the future of fire for this cycle and the current funding situation, our funding to carry out the full program has not been confirmed. So until that gets confirmed, we can't guarantee that we'll move on to the selection process. However, should it be confirmed, we don't want to miss the opportunity to consider submissions. So we still have the call open and are hopeful we'll be able to move forward with the full process of presenting at the summit and providing continued support to winners. In terms of the differences between lab and fire, sorry, there's a little construction going on in our office, so there may be some background noise. The lab is really focused on earlier stage concepts that are working on proof of concept and therefore need a lot of design and pilot preparation support. So it's much more analytically intensive, whereas fire is focused more on early stage projects and businesses that have already demonstrated some model viability on the ground with some current users and or sales. And so what we look to do there is really help provide more profile raising support for those initiatives, for example, at the summit. And then for the winners through business development and strategic support with the pairing with a CPI analyst and working group of experts who help the initiative to reach kind of its next milestones for growth through delivery of a couple of concrete, meaningful pieces of research or pitch development. So those are kind of the two differences. I'm happy to elaborate if there are further questions there.
Thanks so much, Gloria. So just going through and trying to address a few of the other questions. There was a question about how many opportunities we're expecting to select and endorse. So this has varied from year to year and is subject to a number of factors. But we anticipate bringing forward at this point 2 to 3 final instruments, so selecting 2 to 3 final instruments for the global and Brazil labs. For India, I'm not sure what their number is, but I would imagine it would be in that same range. So, for example, we selected the lab selected 3 instruments in the past cycle for each of those labs. And for the global and Brazil lab, all of the instruments were actually endorsed this year. So it's varied a little bit from year on year, and so I can't give a hard and fast number of how many will actually be brought forward. But that gives you an idea of what we're looking to bring this year. There were some other questions, and just to clarify this, and this is also a very common question that we get in terms of how the lab works. Does the lab offer a fixed amount of money for successful proponents, or how much do you get if you're selected as a lab instrument? So as Gloria spoke to a little bit earlier, the guaranteed provision when you're selected as a lab instrument is really around the analytical and communication support that you receive from the Secretariat. And actually, I think Bella was speaking to it a little bit, that there's no guarantee ex ante of a given set of money, but Historically, endorsed lab instruments have been very successful in raising finance, not only from lab members, but from other sources. So the lab itself does not have a pool of money that it grants out. That's always decided on a bilateral basis between the proponents and lab members or potential other funders. So there were questions that came through about what the minimum and maximum amounts are, what's provided in terms of financing. Does the lab take an equity stake in ideas? So again, all of those situations would be decided bilaterally with funders. If that makes sense. Another question came through about geographies. So is Europe part of the Global Lab? The Global Lab is focused globally, but it's really targeting solutions for developing countries exclusively, and then obviously the India and Brazil Lab are focused on those two regions. The FIRE awards are regionally agnostic, so FIRE winners have targeted both developed and developing markets. I'm just going to take another break to see if one of my colleagues wants to address a few of the other questions.
Hi Ben, this is Bella. I can address a couple of questions here as well. One of the questions is about institutional investors and the breakdown in terms of how much institutional investment our instruments have attained or how much they've raised. And rightly so, kind of surprised actually that we have been quite successful in that, because it's very difficult to attract institutional investment, especially in early stage instruments and concepts. So the instruments that have been most successful on this front are our largest ones. And much of that investment comes from one of our instruments, which is called Climate Investor One, which was a 2014 instrument. It's a large renewable energy fund focused on lower middle income countries. And that one has been successful in attracting institutional investors from the UK, South Africa, and the Netherlands at least, and I think even some more. So that is to say that those types of initiatives, the largest ones that can attract sort of the large investment ticket sizes that many institutional investors seek, have been most successful on that front. There were a couple questions. I don't know if Ben, you've already addressed them in detail or want me to address them, but also in terms of the lab's role as a platform, whether the lab is a platform or funding projects directly. I think you've addressed that already, but just to say that the lab is more of a platform, and to clarify that the lab is that Climate Policy Initiative is the secretariat for the lab, but when we say the lab, we're also including the members, many members of the lab from a variety of different institutions, and it's really their role in terms of selecting and identifying and helping to develop and ultimately endorsing the instrument. So there's very active participation from the membership of the lab from the beginning all the way through endorsement and beyond, and I think that's one of the key ingredients that has helped lab instruments raise financing from the membership in addition to external sources, given the kind of key inputs and from the lab members all the way through the process. I'll pause there and turn it back to Ben.
Thanks, Bella. I think Gloria had a couple of questions that she wanted to speak to, so I'll actually just kick it back over to her.
Great. Thanks so much, Ben. Yeah, so there was a question that came in about is there a guarantee that the company that submits the idea will participate? And I would say that generally ideas are in fact stronger when there's an organization already identified that will be implementing the idea. So it's in terms of actionability, I think, that would be a strength for that application, that a company is interested and committed to implementing the idea. That said, over the course of development, the lab is, an open platform looking to share knowledge. So we ultimately hope to see these ideas, once launched and piloted, if successful, replicated by others. And then there was a question about the research support, and the numbers we've put there are a dollar value of our time at CPI, and so that is, can't be transferred to any type of third party. That's a formal part of the lab process, is the work with us on really stress testing ideas and refining the design to ensure strength across all 4 of the key criteria. And then another question kind of related to the other one about the guarantee in terms of the company participating is, would it be better to have anchor investors softly committed? I think that, it's not necessarily too developed, but could potentially be a strength in terms of the actionability of the idea, and having partners already identified and organizations supporting the idea there. That said, actionability is only one of the criteria, and all 4 are weighted equally kind of in the assessment process that the lab members take to select ideas.
Thanks, Gloria. Just speaking to another question that came in about submitting a lab idea focused on Africa. So we actually do have a regional priority this year. So while the Global Lab is accepting ideas that could be applied in any developing country, we often have kind of themes that we present each year, which are guided by our membership base. And one of those this year is Southern Africa. So we do have, we're kind of specifically looking have a call out for ideas that could be deployed in Southern Africa. In addition, a number of very successful instruments that have come through the Global Lab, including Climate Investor One, the Climate Smart Lending Platform, and long-term foreign exchange risk management, are currently being piloted in various geographies in the African continent. So it is certainly a regional focus area for us. So would encourage that person and anyone else to submit ideas that are focused on Africa. And I also realized that I spoke to the first part of Ian Cook's question, but not the second. He asked, what does the lab expect any longer-term involvement, ownership, or other arrangements with launch facilities? So as was mentioned earlier, the Secretariat provides ongoing support to endorsed instruments for about a 6-month period. And that's kind of more robust ongoing support. And then we offer communication support and kind of light touch on an ongoing basis. So we're certainly in close touch with the proponents of those instruments. In terms of the lab as an institution, we also provide periodic platforms for endorsed ideas to give progress updates and meet with investors. One of these was the Lab Innovation Summit, which we had for the first time this past September, and we expect to have on an annual basis going forward, where we actually invited all of the proponents of past lab instruments to come and engage in a number of roundtable discussions with investors, both in the lab membership and also in our broader network, so outside of the lab membership. And then, of course, if one of the instruments is funded by one of the lab members, they have a closer relationship, as a donor, as an investor in that instrument. So hopefully that speaks to that question. I'll just pause for a minute to see if there's any others that my colleagues would like to address. Well, I see a couple of people typing, so we'll just wait a minute to see if some other questions come through. Thanks for all the terrific questions so far.
Okay, thanks so much. I see a couple more great questions coming in. The first one from Drew, can we clarify how the information in the proposals is distributed and what happens with some of the stress test data? Generally in our process, we download the information from the proposals, and a number of CPI analysts will review that information in terms of assessing against the criteria. That information is also prepared into a PowerPoint form, which is provided to the lab members who use it to make decisions on the idea selection. We have in the past, for the fire awards, posted some submission data in an annual fire book. However, that would never be posted without consent from the proponents. A second question coming in is, are the fire awards limited to developed countries? And the answer is that they are not. They consider instruments and solutions and businesses really for any region of the world. And finally, what happens if there is no fire? Shall those applications go to the lab as well? Through our screening process, I think each applicant will need to selectively choose one program that they're applying to. However, the analyst team will identify any applications that could be relevant to another program and will get in touch to consider the proponents and applicant to let them know that their application was identified as a potential fit for one of those others. So as part of that process, if the fire awards don't go through to the next stage of selection, those ideas will have automatically been screened for fit with some of the other programs in case they happen to be a stronger fit. We have in the past had some applicants applying to the lab that we thought were really kind of later stage and already had proof of concept and would be a better fit for fire, move into the fire awards, and also vice versa, where we've had applicants to the fire awards who we've identified as really a stronger fit for the lab, kind of without a project already on the ground and in need of more design support. So I think I'll turn it.
Great. So I think one interesting question came from Doug, becoming a CPI analyst. So go ahead and look on our website. We post any job postings there. So just to be clear, once again, so CPI is an independent nonprofit organization that serves as the secretariat and analytical provider for the lab. So the lab and CPI are different things. But I think we've said that a couple of times, but just to be very clear on that point, since I know it can be a little bit confusing. I think at this point we have hopefully spoken to most or all of the questions that have come through. If your question was not addressed, or if you have additional questions, we are welcome to take those via email. Once again, it's lab@cpiclimatefinance.org. And feel free to reach out, and please do submit an idea to the lab. We look forward to reviewing those, and let us know if you have any other questions. And thanks once again for your time, and thanks to my colleagues who have contributed to the webinar today.